Commander Zefkar clicked his mandibles in amusement as he reviewed the latest intelligence reports from the Galactic Defense Council. The holographic display showed Earth's military contributions to the ongoing war against the savage Vrex Empire, and the numbers were laughably small compared to the other member species. "Look at this pathetic showing," he chittered to his second-in-command, Captain Thulnox. "The humans have sent exactly 12 combat units to support our glorious campaign." 12. The Altarian Empire contributed 3,000 mechanized battalions, and even the peaceful Zinthri managed to send 500 ships. Thulnox's 4 eyes focused on the display, studying the human force composition. These special operations teams they mention, what exactly do they specialize in, Commander? Zefkar waved a dismissive claw. Jungle warfare, apparently. Can you believe it? In an age of plasma cannons and gravitational shields, these primitives think hiding in trees will make a difference. They call themselves Rangers, Green Berets, Navy SEALs, and other meaningless titles. 12 teams of 8 soldiers each. 96 warriors total. The bridge of the massive Kethmoran battlecruiser buzzed with the typical efficiency of a species that had mastered interstellar warfare 3 millennia ago. Screens displayed tactical information from across the warfront, where coalition forces struggled against the relentless Vrex advance. The insectoid Vrex had already consumed 17 star systems, turning entire planets into hive worlds that produced nothing but more warriors. "Sir," Communications Officer Veltar interrupted, "we're receiving deployment requests from the human contingent. They're asking for insertion coordinates on Vrex-occupied worlds." Zefkar's mandibles clicked faster, a sign of extreme amusement among his species. "They want me deployed? Behind enemy lines? With no heavy support, no orbital bombardment, no mechanized backup." He stood from his command throne, his chitinous armor gleaming under the bridge lights. "By the eternal swarm, these humans are either the bravest fools in the galaxy or completely insane." The tactical display shifted to show the current battle situation. 7 worlds had fallen to the Vrex in the past month alone. Each planet that fell meant billions of sentient lives either dead or converted into the Vrex war machine. The coalition forces were being pushed back on every front, despite their technological superiority. "Perhaps," Thulnox suggested cautiously, "we should assign them to reconnaissance duties? Let them gather intelligence while the real warriors handle combat operations." "An excellent idea," Zefkar agreed. "Send them to Kepler, 442b. It fell to the Vrex 6 months ago, and we need updated intelligence on their fortification patterns. A simple scouting mission should be well within their primitive capabilities. If they survive long enough to transmit useful data, we might consider them worth the transport fuel we've wasted on them." The planet Kepler, 442b, had once been home to the aquatic Merdani civilization, renowned throughout the galaxy for their artistic achievements and philosophical contributions. Now it was another dead world, its crystal cities melted into slag, its gentle inhabitants either killed or worse, transformed into Vrex shock troops through horrific biological modification. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison received the mission briefing in the cramped transport vessel that served as the human staging area. At 43, he was a veteran of conflicts on 6 different worlds, his weathered face bearing scars from battles that most galactic citizens had never even heard of. His teams represented the absolute elite of human special operations forces, carefully selected from Earth's most experienced jungle fighters. "Gentlemen," Harrison addressed the assembled team leaders, "Command has given us what they consider a milk run. Intelligence gathering on a dead world. They think we're good for sneaking around and taking pictures." He paused, studying the faces of the 12 men before him. "What they don't understand is that humans have been perfecting the art of unconventional warfare for thousands of years while they were still figuring out which end of a plasma rifle shoots." Master Sergeant Mike Chun, leader of Team Alpha, raised his hand. "Sir, what's the real situation down there?" Harrison activated the holographic display, showing orbital scans of Kepler, 442b. The planet's surface was covered in the characteristic organic architecture of Vrex occupation forces. Massive hive structures rose from former cities like cancerous growths, while patrol patterns showed constant movement of enemy forces. 60 million Vrex warriors, minimum. They've turned the entire planet into a forward operating base. Atmospheric composition is breathable for humans. Gravity is 0.97 Earth standard. The terrain is mostly forested hills and river valleys. In other words, gentlemen, it's perfect hunting ground. The team leaders exchanged glances. These were men who had spent their careers in the jungles of Earth, learning to move unseen through hostile territory, to strike without warning, and to disappear before the enemy could respond. They understood something that their alien allies had forgotten in their millennia of technological advancement. Sometimes the most primitive methods were the most effective. The Vrex have never faced human tactics, Harrison continued. They expect frontal assaults, orbital bombardments, massive mechanized formations. They've adapted their defenses accordingly. What they haven't prepared for is an enemy that can live off the land for months, strike from unexpected directions, and turn their own environment against them. Sergeant First Class David Park, team leader of Bravo Squad, spoke up. Rules of engagement, sir? Harrison's expression grew cold. There are no civilians left on Kepler. 442b. Park. The Vrex don't take prisoners, and they don't leave witnesses. This is total war, and for the first time in this conflict, we're going to fight it on our terms. The human teams spent the next 72 hours in final preparation, while their alien allies focused on massive supply chains and complex technological systems. The humans prepared in ways that would have seemed primitive to galactic observers. They studied local flora and fauna from pre-invasion surveys, learning which plants were edible and which could be used for camouflage. They practiced moving in complete silence, communicating through hand signals that had been refined through generations of warfare. Each team carried weapons that other species would consider obsolete. Chemical projectile rifles, explosive charges triggered by analog timers, bladed weapons forged from simple steel. But they also carried something far more dangerous. The accumulated knowledge of human warfare, passed down through centuries of conflict on a world that had forged them into the most adaptable predators the galaxy had ever seen. As the transport approached Kepler, 442b, Zefkar watched from his command center, already composing the report he would file about the humans' inevitable failure. In his mind, he was performing a service to the galaxy by demonstrating the worthlessness of primitive species in modern warfare. He had no idea that he was about to witness the beginning of a legend that would echo through galactic history for generations to come. The insertion pods hit Kepler, 442b's surface like meteor strikes, but within minutes, the forest had swallowed all trace of their landing. 12 teams of 8 men each had scattered across a continent-sized area, vanishing into terrain that the Vrex considered completely secure. Team Alpha, led by Master Sergeant Shun, found themselves in what had once been a recreational park in the Merdani capital. Ancient walking paths wound between towering trees with silver bark and leaves that chimed softly in the wind. Now those same paths were patrolled by Vrex hunter-killers, six-legged insectoid warriors the size of earth bears, their natural armor gleaming with bioluminescent threat displays. Chen watched through his scope as a patrol of 5 hunter-killers moved along the main trail, their movements precise and coordinated. Behind him, barely visible in the undergrowth, his 7 teammates waited with the patience of apex predators. They had been in position for 6 hours, learning the enemy's patterns, mapping their routes, understanding their behavior. Specialist Rodriguez, their communications expert, tapped Chen's shoulder and pointed to his scanner. 3 more patrols were converging on their location, following a rotation that repeated every 4 hours. The Vrex were methodical, predictable, and completely unprepared for an enemy that could remain motionless for days if necessary. In the Altarian military, soldiers were rotated every 2 hours to maintain combat effectiveness. The Zenthari considered 4-hour watches to be the maximum before warrior efficiency degraded. But humans had learned patience in jungles where moving at the wrong moment meant death. They could wait. 200 kilometers away, Team Charlie had discovered something that would have terrified any conventional military force. Buried beneath the twisted spires of a Vrex hive complex, they found evidence of the enemy's true purpose on Kepler, 442b. The planet wasn't just a forward operating base. It was a breeding facility for something new. Sergeant Williams, Charlie's leader, used hand signals to position his team around the perimeter of what their orbital scans had identified as a minor outpost. Up close, they could see it was anything but minor. The complex stretched deep underground, with massive ventilation shafts that carried the sounds of industrial activity and something else, screaming. Through thermal imaging, they tracked the movement of thousands of Vrex workers carrying organic material into the depths. But more disturbing were the heat signatures coming back out. These weren't standard Vrex warriors. They were larger, more complex, and moving in patterns that suggested enhanced intelligence. Williams activated his long-range communicator, sending a burst transmission encoded in a frequency that the Vrex had never encountered. Within seconds, his message reached every other human team on the planet. Priority target identified. Intelligence critical. New enemy variant confirmed. The response was immediate. Team Delta, positioned near a major transportation hub, began documenting the movement of these new creatures. They were being shipped off-world in specialized biopods, heading toward the front lines where coalition forces were barely holding their positions. Captain Sarah Kim, Delta's leader, realized they were witnessing the development of a new Vrex super soldier program. Each creature was the size of a small vehicle, with enhanced armor plating and what appeared to be integrated weapons systems. If these things reached the main battle zones, the war would be over in weeks. But humans had learned something in their long history of warfare that the galaxy's other species had forgotten. Sometimes the best strategy isn't to report what you've found. Sometimes the best strategy is to ensure it never leaves the laboratory. Over the next 72 hours, the 12 teams began implementing tactics that would have been impossible for any conventional military force. They lived off the land, constructing shelters from local materials that were invisible to Vrex sensors. They moved only at night, using natural sounds to mask their approach. Most importantly, they began to hunt. Team Bravo took the first Vrex patrol. 8 hunter-killers moving through a narrow valley simply vanished without sending any distress signal. The team had used crossbows with steel-tipped bolts, silent weapons that left no energy signature for Vrex sensors to detect. The bodies were dragged into carefully prepared positions that made it appear the patrol had been killed by local predators. Within 48 hours, the pattern repeated across the planet. Vrex patrols began disappearing with increasing frequency. Security forces found evidence of animal attacks, claw marks, bite patterns, and organic residue that matched local fauna. The Vrex, despite their intelligence, had never encountered an enemy that could manipulate crime scenes to hide their activities. Team Echo, specializing in explosive devices, began a campaign of sabotage that pushed the boundaries of creative destruction. They used locally manufactured chemicals to create bombs that mimicked geological events. Supply convoys were destroyed by what appeared to be spontaneous landslides. Power generators exploded in ways that suggested mechanical failure rather than enemy action. The psychological effect on Vrex forces was immediate and devastating. These were creatures that had conquered 17 star systems through overwhelming force and technological superiority. They understood orbital bombardment, mechanized assault, and energy weapon exchanges. They had no framework for understanding an enemy that struck without warning and vanished without trace. Commander Zefkar monitored the situation from orbit, growing increasingly frustrated with Vrex reports of equipment failures and animal attacks. His sensors showed no sign of human military activity, no energy discharges, no communications intercepts. According to every technological metric he possessed, the 12 human teams had simply disappeared after landing. Perhaps they were killed in the insertion, Thul Knox suggested. Their primitive equipment might have malfunctioned during planetary entry. But deep in the forests of Kepler 442b, the human teams were just getting started. They had spent weeks learning the planet's ecosystem, studying Vrex behavior patterns, and identifying critical vulnerabilities in the enemy's infrastructure. Now they were ready to implement the kind of warfare that had made humanity the dominant species on Earth despite competing against creatures with natural weapons, armor, and advantages that should have made them invincible. Sergeant Thompson of Team Golf had discovered that Vrex warriors communicated through bioelectric pulses that could be disrupted using electromagnetic fields generated by modified Earth electronics. His team began deploying these devices near Vrex communication hubs, creating dead zones where enemy forces lost contact with their command structure. Lost patrols began wandering in circles, unable to navigate without their constant data link to the hive mind. Some groups turned on each other, interpreting the communication breakdown as evidence of traitors in their ranks. The careful order that defined Vrek's military operations began to fragment as paranoia and confusion spread through the occupation force. Team Hotel took a different approach. Using knowledge gained from Earth's biological warfare programs, they began introducing modified Earth bacteria into Vrek's food supplies. The organisms were harmless to most galactic species, but caused severe digestive dysfunction in creatures with Vrek's biology. Within days, significant portions of the occupation force were too ill to maintain patrol schedules. What the Vreks didn't understand was that they were facing an enemy that had evolved not just to fight other humans, but to fight every other species on Earth. Humans had survived ice ages, supervolcanic eruptions, pandemic diseases, and countless natural disasters by developing an adaptability that no other galactic species could match. As the fourth day ended, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison transmitted a brief status report to the Coalition fleet. Reconnaissance phase complete. Beginning primary operations. Zefkar received the transmission with a mixture of confusion and grudging respect. Somehow, impossibly, the primitive humans had survived longer than anyone had predicted. But whatever they planned to do next, he was certain it would be a minor footnote to the real war being fought with proper weapons and civilized tactics. He could not have been more wrong. The Vrek's High Command received their first indication that something was seriously wrong when Hive Complex 7 went silent during the middle of a production cycle. The facility had been manufacturing the new super soldiers that would turn the tide of the galactic war. One moment, it was operating at full capacity. The next, all communications ceased. Orbital surveillance showed no signs of attack. No explosion signatures, no energy weapon discharges, no evidence of orbital bombardment. The complex simply stopped responding, as if every Vrex inside had simultaneously decided to stop working. Warprime Nexus, the supreme Vrex commander for the Kepler 442b occupation, dispatched an entire battalion to investigate. What they found defied every tactical manual in the Vrex military database. The complex was intact but empty. Every Vrex warrior, worker, and technician had vanished without trace. The super soldier production chambers stood open, their valuable contents gone. Security recordings showed nothing unusual until the final moments, when every camera simultaneously developed the same malfunction, a strange interference pattern that looked almost like static. But Team India knew better. They had spent 2 days studying Vrex electronic systems, learning to replicate the exact frequency patterns that would create blind spots in enemy sensors. While the cameras showed static, 8 human operators moved through the complex like ghosts, systematically evacuating over 3,000 Vrex personnel. The evacuation wasn't violent. It was something far worse. It was impossible to understand. Using a combination of Earth-developed narcotics and advanced understanding of Vrex physiology, the humans had rendered the entire complex unconscious within minutes. The enemy warriors were then relocated to carefully prepared holding areas deep in the planet's cave systems, where they would remain sedated for weeks while biological agents slowly altered their brain chemistry. Dr. Lisa Park, Team India's medical specialist, had spent months before deployment studying captured Vrex biology. She discovered that their hive mind communication system relied on specific neurotransmitters that could be suppressed using modified Earth pharmaceuticals. The affected Vrex wouldn't die. They would simply lose their connection to the collective consciousness that defined their species. To the Vrex, this was worse than death. It was a complete erasure of identity, purpose, and meaning. But to humans, it was just another tool in the arsenal they had developed during thousands of years of warfare against superior opponents. Team Juliet had discovered something even more valuable. The Vrex command structure was entirely dependent on real-time communication with their homeworlds. Cut those connections, and local commanders had no idea how to adapt to changing circumstances. The species that had conquered star systems through overwhelming coordination became helpless when forced to think independently. Using captured Vrex equipment modified with Earth electronics, Juliet began broadcasting interference patterns on every frequency the enemy used for communication. Within hours, Vrex units across the planet lost contact with their superiors and began operating according to increasingly outdated orders. Some patrols continued searching for threats that had already been neutralized. Others repeated the same mission objectives for days without realizing their targets no longer existed. The rigid hierarchy that made the Vrex so effective in conventional warfare became a fatal weakness when facing an enemy that could manipulate information flow. Commander Zefkar watched his tactical displays with growing alarm as red indicators spread across the planet's surface. Vrex positions were going dark with increasing frequency, but his sensors showed no evidence of human military activity. According to every piece of technology at his disposal, the 12 human teams had accomplished nothing more significant than taking photographs and soil samples. "This is impossible," he chittered to Thulnox. 160,000 Vrex warriors don't simply disappear without leaving evidence of combat. There must be some kind of technological malfunction in our monitoring systems. But Team Kilo had been monitoring those same systems for days, learning to understand Keth Moran's sensor technology better than the engineers who designed it. Humans had always excelled at reverse engineering superior technology, adapting it to purposes its creators never intended. Using components scavenged from their insertion pods and modified with equipment borrowed from neutralized Vrex positions, Kilo had constructed a network of false sensor readings that painted exactly the picture the Coalition fleet expected to see: primitive humans stumbling around in the wilderness, posing no threat to anyone. The reality was very different. By the end of the first week, human forces controlled nearly 40% of the planet's surface area without firing a single shot that registered on enemy sensors. They moved through Vrex territory like a virus, infecting the occupation force with confusion, paranoia, and systematic dysfunction. Team Lima had turned biological warfare into an art form. Using their knowledge of Earth ecology, they introduced modified organisms into Vrex agricultural systems. The crops didn't die. They simply became inedible to creatures with Vrex biology while remaining perfectly nutritious for the human teams living off captured supplies. Vrex warriors began experiencing chronic malnutrition despite having abundant food supplies. Their performance degraded steadily as essential nutrients were replaced with compounds that their bodies couldn't process. Within days, elite hunter-killer units were moving with the sluggish coordination of creatures operating on starvation rations. But the most devastating attack came from an unexpected source. Team Mike had discovered that Vrex psychology was completely unprepared for asymmetric warfare. These were creatures that had evolved as part of a hive mind, thinking collectively, acting with perfect coordination. The concept of individual initiative was as alien to them as telepathy was to humans. Mike began implementing psychological warfare tactics developed during Earth's most brutal conflicts. They left evidence of impossible activities: Vrex equipment found in locations no enemy could reach, messages written in Vrex script that contained information no outsider could know, and, most disturbing of all, recordings of Vrex voices saying things that no loyal warrior would ever speak. The paranoia was infectious. Vrex units began investigating each other for signs of treason. Command structures broke down as officers questioned the loyalty of their subordinates. The hive mind that had made them invincible began turning against itself as false information spread through their communication networks. War Prime Nexus found himself commanding an army that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. His forces controlled every strategic position on the planet according to tactical maps, but those same forces were unable to perform basic military functions. Patrols vanished, supply lines failed, and communication networks carried increasingly unreliable information. He had never faced an enemy like this because no enemy like this had ever existed. Humans were the first species in galactic history to develop warfare as an art form rather than a scientific exercise. They understood that the goal wasn't to destroy enemy forces. It was to make those forces destroy themselves. On the seventh day, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison transmitted his second status report. Primary objectives achieved ahead of schedule. Recommend immediate implementation of secondary phase. Zefkar received the message with a mixture of disbelief and growing respect. Whatever these humans had accomplished with their primitive methods, they had apparently exceeded their own expectations. But surely they understood that reconnaissance and sabotage were minor irritants compared to the real business of interstellar warfare. The answer came 18 hours later, when every Vrex position on Kepler 442b went dark simultaneously. The planet that had served as the primary breeding ground for the Vrex Empire's new super soldiers, the launching point for attacks that would have ended the Galactic War, had fallen to 96 humans armed with weapons that most species considered obsolete. But more shocking than the victory itself was the method. There was no evidence that a battle had ever taken place. From orbit, Kepler 442b looked exactly the same as it had 2 weeks earlier. The hive complexes stood intact, power grids continued functioning, and atmospheric readings showed no signs of combat. According to every sensor and scanner available to galactic science, nothing had happened. But in the depths of space, monitoring stations throughout the Vrex Empire registered something that would haunt their collective consciousness for generations to come. Complete silence from their most important forward operating base. The humans hadn't just won. They had done something far more terrifying. They had made an entire Vrex world disappear without anyone understanding how. The Galactic Defense Council emergency session convened in absolute chaos. Representatives from 47 different species crowded into the chamber aboard the massive station orbiting Proxima Centauri, their voices creating a cacophony of confusion and disbelief. At the center of it all sat Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, still wearing the simple camouflage uniform that had somehow accomplished the impossible. High Chancellor Velmoth of the Zenthari Collective called for order with visible difficulty. According to our intelligence reports, the planet Kepler 442b has been neutralized. An entire Vrex occupation force, totaling over 200,000 warriors, has been eliminated or captured. The facility producing their new super soldiers has been destroyed. And somehow, this was accomplished by fewer than 100 human operatives. The chamber erupted again. The Altarian War Marshal rose to his full 3-meter height, his crystalline features blazing with indignation. This is impossible. Our best mechanized divisions have been unable to reclaim a single Vrex world despite overwhelming technological superiority. These primitives claim to have taken an entire planet with personal weapons. Harrison stood calmly, his weathered face showing no expression. We didn't take the planet, Marshal. We simply made it unusable to the enemy. There's a difference. Explain this difference, demanded Admiral Corax of the Kethmoran fleet. His mandibles clicked with barely controlled frustration. Our sensors show no evidence of large-scale combat. No orbital bombardment, no energy weapon signatures, no conventional military activity whatsoever. What kind of primitive trickery did you employ? For the first time since entering the chamber, Harrison smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. We employed the same tactics that made humanity the dominant species on a world filled with creatures stronger, faster, and better armed than we were. We used intelligence, adaptation, and the one advantage we've always possessed, the willingness to think like our enemies until we understood them better than they understood themselves. He activated a holographic display showing the current status of Kepler 442b. From orbit, the planet looked exactly as it had before the human insertion. Cities stood intact, infrastructure operated normally, and life signs indicated continued Vrex presence throughout the surface installations. The Vrex are still there, Harrison explained. All 200,000 of them. They're alive, healthy, and completely neutralized. They've been disconnected from their hive mind communication system through targeted biological agents that suppress specific neurotransmitters. They're now incapable of coordinated military action and psychologically unable to function as individuals. The chamber fell silent. Several representatives exchanged glances that suggested they were reconsidering everything they thought they knew about warfare. You turned them into civilians, whispered Chancellor Velmoth. An entire military force, reduced to helpless non-combatants without firing a shot. More than that, Harrison continued. We've established permanent human oversight of the planet. My teams have taken control of all communication systems, supply networks, and transportation infrastructure. The Vrex population believes they're still following orders from their homeworlds, but those orders now come from carefully designed human psychological operations. Admiral Corax leaned forward, his alien features reflecting a mixture of horror and fascination. You've enslaved an entire species without them realizing it. "We've neutralized a military threat while preserving every life on the planet," Harrison corrected. "The Vrex will continue their daily routines, maintain their facilities, and even believe they're serving their empire's interests. But every action they take will actually serve coalition objectives. They become unwitting allies in their own defeat." The implications rippled through the chamber like a shockwave. The galactic community had been fighting the Vrex Empire for 3 years, losing billions of lives and countless worlds in brutal campaigns of mutual annihilation. The humans had found a way to win without killing anyone. War Marshal Thun of the Regellian Confederation stood slowly, his massive frame casting shadows across the assembly. "If this technique can be replicated on other Vrex worlds, it can be," Harrison confirmed. "Human teams are already prepared for deployment to 17 additional Vrex-occupied systems. We've identified the biological and psychological vulnerabilities that make this approach possible. The enemy's greatest strength, their hive mind coordination, is also their greatest weakness when facing an opponent who understands how to exploit it." The chamber buzzed with urgent conversations as representatives began calculating the strategic implications. If humans could neutralize Vrex worlds without destroying them, the war could end without the massive casualties everyone had assumed were inevitable. But Admiral Korax remained skeptical. "Even if your primitive methods work against the Vrex, you're still just one species with limited numbers. How do you propose to simultaneously attack 17 star systems with fewer than 50,000 total military personnel?" Harrison's smile widened. "That's the beauty of asymmetric warfare, Admiral. We don't need massive armies when we can turn the enemy against themselves. Each human team can multiply their effectiveness by recruiting local resistance movements, exploiting existing political tensions, and weaponizing the enemy's own infrastructure against them." He activated another display, showing detailed intelligence reports from across the Vrex Empire. The hive mind that makes them so effective in battle also makes them vulnerable to information warfare. They trust their communication networks absolutely, which means false information spreads through their systems faster than authentic orders. A single human team with the right equipment can convince entire Vrex fleets that their own allies are traitors. The revelation sent another wave of shock through the assembly. The Vrex Empire, which had seemed invincible just hours earlier, was suddenly revealed as a house of cards waiting to collapse under the weight of its own assumptions. Chancellor Velmoth struggled to maintain diplomatic composure. "Colonel Harrison, are you suggesting that humanity has developed the capability to end this war within a matter of months rather than decades?" "I'm suggesting we've already begun ending it," Harrison replied. "While you're debating strategy in this chamber, my teams have been implementing operations across 7 Vrex-controlled systems. By the time you complete your deliberations, those worlds will be ready for liberation by conventional forces, if liberation is even necessary." He paused, scanning the faces of the assembled representatives. "The real question isn't whether we can defeat the Vrex. It's whether you're prepared to accept victory achieved through methods that don't fit your understanding of civilized warfare." The challenge hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Every species in the chamber prided themselves on their advanced technology, their sophisticated military doctrines, and their evolved approach to interstellar conflict. The idea that primitive humans could succeed where they had failed struck at the core of their galactic identity. Admiral Korax spoke first, his voice carrying a grudging respect that he clearly found disturbing. "Your methods are effective, but they raise questions about the future of galactic civilization. If warfare becomes a matter of psychological manipulation and biological sabotage, what happens to honor, courage, and the warrior traditions that have defined our species for millennia?" Harrison's expression grew serious. "Admiral, those traditions are luxuries that you can afford because you've never faced extinction. Humanity spent 10,000 years fighting for survival against predators, diseases, natural disasters, and each other. We learned that honor is meaningless if your species dies out, and courage is worthless if it doesn't lead to victory. We fight to win, not to demonstrate our nobility." The truth of it settled over the chamber like a heavy blanket. These representatives came from species that had achieved interstellar travel, conquered natural disasters, and built civilizations that spanned multiple worlds. But They had never faced the kind of existential pressure that had forged humanity into the ultimate survivors. Von Marshall Thun nodded slowly. Perhaps it's time for the galaxy to learn from Earth's harder lessons. If your methods can end this war, we would be fools to reject them based on aesthetic preferences. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Humanity's special operations teams would be given full authorization to conduct warfare by any means necessary against the Vrex Empire. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had just admitted that sometimes the most primitive methods were the most effective. As the session ended, Admiral Corax approached Harrison privately. "Colonel, I must ask, if your species can accomplish this against the Vrex, what prevents you from using these same methods against your allies?" Harrison met his gaze steadily. "The same thing that's always prevented it, Admiral. We only fight to protect what we care about. As long as our allies remain allies, they have nothing to fear from human capabilities." But, as Corax watched the human officer leave the chamber, he couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy had just witnessed the emergence of a new apex predator, one that hunted not with claws or energy weapons, but with an intelligence shaped by eons of survival against impossible odds. 6 months after the Kepler 442b operation, the Galactic Defense Council gathered once again, but the atmosphere in the chamber had completely transformed. Where chaos and desperation had once reigned, now there was an almost supernatural quiet. The war that had consumed the galaxy for 3 years was over, ended not with a final climactic battle, but with something far more unsettling: the complete disappearance of Vrex resistance. High Chancellor Velmoth reviewed the final reports with visible discomfort. 17 Vrex-controlled star systems have been neutralized. Total Vrex military casualties, 0. Total coalition casualties, 14 wounded, none killed. Infrastructure damage, negligible. Civilian populations, unharmed and largely unaware that anything has changed. She paused, studying the faces of representatives who still struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. The Vrex Empire, which controlled 43 star systems and commanded fleets numbering in the millions, has simply stopped functioning as a military force. Admiral Corax activated the main display, showing current intelligence from across former Vrex territory. Vrex populations continue their daily routines, maintain their installations, and operate their technology exactly as before. But every communication they send now passes through human-controlled relay stations. Every order they follow originates from human psychological operations centers. They believe they're still serving their empire, but they're actually contributing to galactic reconstruction efforts. The implications were staggering. Humanity had not conquered the Vrex Empire. They had absorbed it without anyone noticing. 43 star systems that had been closed to galactic civilization were now functioning as unwitting members of the coalition, their populations convinced they were advancing their own military objectives while actually supporting peace initiatives. War Marshal Thun spoke for many in the chamber when he said, "This is not how wars are supposed to end. There should be surrender ceremonies, peace treaties, territorial negotiations. Instead, we have an enemy that doesn't know it's been defeated, serving an alliance it doesn't know it's joined." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, now promoted to general and serving as Earth's official representative to the Defense Council, stood to address the assembly. At 44, he looked exactly as he had 6 months earlier, but everyone in the chamber now understood they were in the presence of the most dangerous military mind the galaxy had ever produced. "The war ended the way all human conflicts end," he said simply, with a defeated party convinced that cooperation serves their interests better than resistance. "The Vrex aren't prisoners or slaves. They're partners who happen to be pursuing goals we've helped them choose. But they have no idea this has happened," protested the Zenthri representative. "Their entire species is living a carefully constructed lie designed and maintained by human operatives." Harrison nodded. "For now. But lies become truth when they persist long enough. In 10 years, young Vrex will grow up believing that cooperation with galactic civilization is a natural part of their heritage. In 20 years, the idea of conquering other species will seem as alien to them as the idea of living in trees seems to you." The chamber fell silent as representatives contemplated a form of victory that redefined the very concept of conquest. Humanity hadn't destroyed their enemies. They had transformed them into something new while allowing them to believe they remained unchanged. Admiral Korax reviewed his notes with obvious reluctance. Our analysis suggests that human special operations teams now maintain covert influence over approximately 62% of known galactic civilization, not through conquest or coercion, but through the systematic placement of advisory positions, communication oversight, and what you call cultural guidance initiatives. The revelation hit the chamber like a physical blow. While everyone had been focused on the Vrex War, humanity had been quietly establishing influence networks throughout Allied space. They hadn't seized control of anything. They had simply made themselves indispensable to the operation of galactic society. "How long has this been happening?" demanded the Altarian representative, his crystalline features reflecting genuine alarm. Harrison consulted a datapad with casual efficiency. "Since the day we joined the galactic community, humans have always understood that the most effective form of power is the kind that doesn't look like power. We offer assistance, provide expertise, solve problems that others find difficult. Over time, societies begin to depend on that assistance without realizing they've become dependent." He gestured to the assembled representatives. "How many of your worlds currently employ human advisors in critical positions? How many of your communication networks rely on technology that humans have helped design or maintain? How many of your military strategies incorporate tactical innovations that my people suggested?" The uncomfortable shifting throughout the chamber provided the answer. Humanity's patient integration into galactic civilization had been so gradual, so beneficial, and so non-threatening that no one had recognized it as a form of expansion until it was complete. Chancellor Velmoth spoke carefully, clearly aware she might be addressing the real power behind galactic governance. "General Harrison, are you saying that Earth has systematically infiltrated every major civilization in known space?" "I'm saying that humans have made ourselves useful to everyone we've encountered," Harrison replied. "We've solved problems, ended conflicts, improved efficiency, and enhanced security wherever we've been invited to help. The fact that this has resulted in significant human influence over galactic affairs is simply a natural consequence of being good at what we do." The distinction was crucial but terrifying. Humanity hadn't conquered anyone. They had simply become too valuable to reject and too integrated to remove. They were the spider at the center of a web that everyone else had helped them weave. War Marshal Thun raised a question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted a voice. "What happens if we decide we no longer want human assistance?" Harrison's smile was polite and absolutely chilling. "That's entirely your choice, Marshal. Humans have always respected the sovereignty of other species. Of course, you would need to replace the expertise we've provided, rebuild the systems we've helped design, and solve the problems we've been addressing. I'm sure your people are capable of managing without us." The threat was invisible but unmistakable. Humanity had made itself so integral to galactic civilization that removing human influence would require dismantling much of the infrastructure that kept dozens of worlds functioning. It would be like trying to remove a species' nervous system while keeping the organism alive. Admiral Korax, finally, asked a question that had been haunting military strategists throughout the galaxy. "General, did your species plan this from the beginning? Was joining the galactic community always part of a larger strategy to achieve dominance without conquest?" Harrison considered the question with apparent seriousness. "Admiral, humans have been planning survival strategies since we lived in caves and fought saber-toothed tigers with pointed sticks. We learned that the best way to avoid being eaten was to make ourselves too valuable to kill and too dangerous to ignore. When we encountered galactic civilization, we simply applied the same principles that had kept us alive for 10,000 years." He paused, scanning the faces around him. "The difference is that we never wanted to rule anyone. We wanted to survive and prosper. It just happens that our survival strategy involves making everyone around us survive and prosper as well. The galaxy is safer, more prosperous, and more peaceful than it's been in recorded history. If that's the result of human influence, I consider a victory for everyone involved." The session ended without formal resolutions or dramatic declarations. Representatives simply filed out, each returning to worlds that were undeniably better managed, more secure, and more prosperous than they had been before humanity's arrival. But now they understood that this improvement had come with a price. The gradual transfer of real power to a species that exercised it so subtly that most people never realized it existed. In the months that followed, no government attempted to reduce human influence. The practical benefits were too obvious, the integration too complete, and the alternative too dangerous to contemplate. Humanity had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history, an empire built on competence rather than force, maintained through gratitude rather than fear, and expanded through invitation rather than conquest. The galaxy had mocked Earth's primitive jungle fighters and their obsolete weapons. But in the end, those same fighters had demonstrated that the most advanced technology in the universe was still no match for 10,000 years of human ingenuity applied to the fundamental problem of survival. The Vrex Empire had fallen without knowing it was beaten. Galactic civilization had been transformed without realizing it was changing. And humanity had become the dominant species in known space without anyone understanding how it had happened. They had dropped a phantom into the galaxy's military affairs. And when the smoke cleared, everything had changed while appearing to remain exactly the same. It was Admiral Corax reflected in his private logs, the most terrifying victory in the history of interstellar warfare. And the humans are just getting started.